War is often remembered in the sound of gunfire, the clash of armies, and the speeches of generals. But hidden within those shadows are the quiet, unspoken realities that rarely find their way into history books. One of these forgotten stories lies in the secret brothels of the Second World War places, where soldiers, caught between duty and despair, sought comfort, distraction, or survival. Behind the front lines, prostitution existed as an open secret, a complex and uncomfortable part of wartime life that reveals not only the desires of men, but also the suffering and resilience of women. Tonight, we will wander through that hidden world, gently exploring how prostitution shaped and was shaped by the chaos of World War II. Before we begin, I'd like to invite you to take a deep breath, settle into a comfortable position, and let the weight of the day fall away. If you are new here, welcome to History for Sleep. This channel is a space where stories from the past are told in a calm, soothing way, designed to help you drift off while still learning about the forgotten corners of history. If you find these stories comforting, I invite you to subscribe so you'll never miss another night of history. And if there's a topic you'd like to hear, or if you simply want to share when and how you listen, whether it's late at night, during a restless morning, or while winding down after work, leave a comment below. Your thoughts help shape the stories we tell, and your presence here is truly valued. As we begin this journey into the secret brothels behind the front lines, remember that this is not a tale of glamour or scandal, but of human need, desperation, and the strange ways war reshapes society. Some of what you hear may be unsettling, yet told softly, it becomes a reminder that even in the darkest hours of history, there were hidden lives, unfolding stories whispered, and memories carried in silence long after the guns went quiet. So let us begin, slowly and carefully, to uncover what was once hidden behind closed doors. When war sweeps across nations, it brings with it hunger, loss, fear, and destruction. Yet at the same time, it also stirs up aspects of life that are often left unspoken. One of these is the enduring presence of desire, intimacy, and the human need for closeness. The Second World War, though remembered as a time of battles, strategies, and political upheaval, was also shaped by the quiet and hidden economies of human interaction. Soldiers who marched across Europe, Asia, and Africa carried not only rifles and rations, but also loneliness, longing, and the weight of separation from the familiar comforts of home. In that space of absence, prostitution found its place, sometimes tolerated, sometimes forbidden, and often forced into the shadows. It became both a release and a burden, an industry that flourished behind the front lines of war, sustained by soldiers' needs and women's struggle for survival. The roots of prostitution during the war were not new. Long before the 1940s, armies had been accompanied by women who offered companionship in exchange for money, food, or protection. In earlier wars, these relationships were often informal and unregulated, existing in the margins where soldiers and civilians met. By the time of the Second World War, however, the scale of the conflict demanded new approaches, and governments recognized, whether quietly or openly, that prostitution could not be entirely erased from the wartime landscape. Instead, it was managed, shaped, and at times manipulated, revealing the uneasy balance between morality and pragmatism. Soldiers lived in a world where danger lurked around every corner, and where the possibility of death came with each passing day. In that environment, the body's need for touch and intimacy did not simply vanish. Letters from home and photographs of loved ones offered comfort, but they could not replace physical closeness. For many soldiers, brothels became the spaces where these desires were confronted, satisfied, or complicated. Some went willingly, some reluctantly, and others perhaps never at all, but the presence of prostitution was undeniable. It existed in barracks whispers, in towns captured by advancing armies, and in the hidden agreements struck between civilians and military officials. For the women who became involved, The reasons were as varied as the circumstances of war itself. Some were forced, drawn into systems of exploitation that treated their bodies as tools of the state. Others chose prostitution as a means of survival, exchanging services for food, clothing, or safety in times when bombs destroyed livelihoods and markets collapsed. And still others found themselves swept into this world through coercion, poverty, or manipulation. The war blurred the lines between choice and necessity, making it difficult to determine where agency ended and exploitation began. In this way, prostitution during the war cannot be seen as a single story, but rather as a tapestry of individual lives caught between survival and subjugation. In occupied regions, prostitution became a reflection of power. Where German troops marched into France, Poland, or the Netherlands, brothels quickly followed, sometimes established officially, other times organized through local intermediaries. These spaces were not merely sites of intimacy, but also symbols of control. Who entered, who was allowed, and who was excluded all reflected the racial ideologies and military priorities of the occupiers. Women of certain backgrounds were forbidden to participate, while others were forced into service to meet the demands of occupying armies. In this way, prostitution mirrored the broader patterns of oppression, hierarchy, and violence that marked the war. The Allied side was not exempt from these practices. Though perhaps less systematic, Allied soldiers, too, encountered brothels in cities and villages. Some armies, like the French, had long histories of officially sanctioned military brothels. Others, like the Americans, faced moral debates over whether to tolerate or forbid such institutions. Yet even where official policy frowned upon prostitution, soldiers found their own ways, whether through underground networks, informal arrangements, or civilian-run establishments that catered to the influx of foreign troops. These interactions became part of the daily rhythm of war, woven into the larger story of how men and women navigated survival in extraordinary times. The secrecy surrounding prostitution in wartime was deliberate. It was rarely acknowledged in official histories, rarely photographed, and rarely spoken of in public forums. To speak openly about it would have meant confronting uncomfortable truths about the sacrifices demanded of women, the hypocrisies of military leadership, and the moral compromises made in the name of discipline and efficiency. Yet beneath the silence, the reality was well known. Soldiers told stories among themselves, rumors circulated in barracks, and civilians whispered about the women who disappeared into certain buildings after dark. For every official denial, there were countless unrecorded encounters that told a different story. What makes the history of prostitution in the Second World War particularly striking is how it reveals the human side of a conflict often told through tanks and airplanes. It reminds us that war is not only a matter of strategy and numbers, but also of hearts, bodies, and the quiet struggles of individuals who tried to navigate its chaos. For the men, it was often a way to escape loneliness, if only briefly. For the women, it was often a way to endure the devastation of war, to find sustenance when none could be found, or, tragically, to survive under coercion when choices were stripped away. Both sides of this interaction reveal a truth about war that is difficult to confront, that even in the midst of destruction, the rhythms of desire and survival continued. The story of prostitution in the war is also the story of silence. Many women never spoke of their experiences, either because they were too painful or because society left no room for them to do so. Shame, stigma, and fear of judgment kept countless voices quiet. Only in later years did some survivors begin to share their memories, often breaking decades of silence to tell stories that had long been suppressed. Their testimonies reveal not only what happened behind closed doors, but also the weight of carrying those memories into the future, unacknowledged and often unrecognized. As we look into this hidden world, it is important to move gently, to understand the humanity behind the headlines, and to see the complexity that lies beneath the surface. Prostitution in the Second World War was not simply about pleasure or profit. It was about survival, power, exploitation, and resilience. It was a story of shadows, of lives lived in secrecy, of choices made under impossible circumstances, and of desires that persisted even when the world was falling apart. In those shadows, we find the beginnings of our journey into the secret brothels behind the front lines. A journey that will take us from official military policies to whispered civilian arrangements, from acts of survival to the weight of unspoken memories. And so, as we close this first chapter, let us remember that behind every statistic, behind every military directive, and behind every brothel, door was a human being shaped by the war, and yet enduring it in ways history has often overlooked. It is these hidden lives, both painful and profound, that we will uncover as we move deeper into the story. As the war deepened and armies stretched across continents, the presence of prostitution was no longer something that could be ignored or left to chance. Governments and military authorities, faced with the realities of millions of men stationed far from home, began to formalize, regulate, and sometimes even expand the institution of brothels. These establishments, often hidden from public discussion, but well known to the soldiers who used them, became an official part of the machinery of war. They were not simply tolerated, but, in many cases, actively organized by military leadership, justified as a means of controlling desire, maintaining discipline, and protecting health. The existence of such brothels reveals how states, caught in the enormity of war, were willing to regulate even the most intimate aspects of human life. The German Wehrmacht, for example, established a vast network of military brothels across occupied Europe. From France to Poland, from Norway to Greece, official houses of prostitution were set up under military supervision. These brothels were not improvised. They were part of a calculated policy that aimed to satisfy the needs of soldiers while preventing disorder and minimizing the spread of venereal diseases. Women were recruited sometimes voluntarily, often under pressure, and placed under medical surveillance to ensure the health of the soldiers. Rules were strict, visits were timed, and in some cases, registers were kept of which soldiers entered and when. What might have appeared to the outside world as mere houses of pleasure were, in truth, highly controlled institutions, shaped by the ideology and bureaucracy of a totalitarian regime. The Japanese Imperial Army went even further, establishing the infamous comfort stations across Asia. Here, prostitution was not only formalized, but also militarized, woven into the very structure of the army's expansion. Tens of thousands of women, many of them forced from Korea, China, the Philippines, and other occupied territories, were made to serve in these facilities. Unlike some European systems, where women might at times exercise limited agency, the Japanese comfort women were overwhelmingly coerced, deceived, or outright abducted. Their suffering was immense, and the scars they carried lasted long after the war. For the Japanese military, the justification was similar: to control soldiers' desires, prevent assaults on civilians, and maintain order within the ranks. Yet behind that justification lay profound cruelty, revealing how official policy could turn human beings into instruments of war. The French, too, maintained their own system of military brothels, known as Bordels Militaires de Campage, or BMCs. These had existed since the early 20th century and were considered a practical necessity for colonial troops as well as French soldiers. During World War II, as armies moved through North Africa, Italy, and later France itself, these establishments followed. Unlike in the Japanese system, the French model often involved civilian women who entered the profession for payment, though exploitation and inequality were never absent. For French authorities, the brothels were framed as a way to protect not only the health of soldiers, but also the safety of local populations, reducing the risk of uncontrolled encounters. These BMCs became a quiet but steady part of the Army's infrastructure, an acknowledgement that even in the most disciplined force, desire had to be managed. Other armies faced their own debates. The Americans, for instance, were officially opposed to prostitution. Military leaders discouraged the use of brothels and warned soldiers against venereal diseases. Yet despite these policies, American troops stationed abroad encountered civilian-run establishments, and in many cases, military police turned a blind eye. In practice, regulation often fell to local authorities rather than the U.S. command, but the presence of prostitution was undeniable. Even where official lines forbade it, the realities of war blurred moral boundaries, and soldiers found their own ways to seek out intimacy. The medical dimension of these brothels cannot be overlooked. For military planners, the greatest fear was not moral corruption, but disease. Venereal infections could cripple units, reduce effectiveness, and drain resources. By placing prostitution under official oversight, armies sought to minimize this risk. Women in brothels were often subjected to regular medical examinations, sometimes under harsh and invasive conditions. Soldiers, too, were monitored, and in some cases, prophylactics were distributed or even mandated. The body of the soldier was a resource to be maintained and protected, and the bodies of women were drawn into that system of control. It was a stark reminder of how, in war, individuals could be reduced to functions within a larger machine. Yet behind the bureaucratic logic and medical supervision lay deeper contradictions. On one hand, these brothels were justified as a way to preserve order, prevent assaults, and provide an outlet for desire. On the other hand, they institutionalized exploitation, reducing women to regulated commodities. They reflected the gendered hierarchies of the time, where the needs of soldiers were prioritized over the rights of women, and where survival often meant entering a system not of one's choosing. To walk through the door of an official military brothel was to step into a space shaped not only by intimacy, but also by politics, ideology, and power. In occupied territories, the existence of official brothels carried additional meaning. For civilians, their presence was a daily reminder of subjugation. Women seen entering or leaving such establishments faced stigma and suspicion, regardless of their circumstances. Families whispered, neighbors judged, and communities carried the burden of shame. Even after the war, these memories lingered, unspoken yet heavy, shaping how survivors remembered both themselves and those around them. The official brothel, then, was not only a site of wartime intimacy, but also a marker of social rupture, a wound carried long after peace returned. What stands out when we reflect on these systems is how thoroughly governments and militaries sought to regulate something so intimate. Prostitution, which in times of peace existed in the margins of society, was brought under the arm of the state, transformed into an instrument of war. It reveals the lengths to which nations will go in pursuit of control, even over the most private aspects of human existence. The story of official military brothels is not merely one of soldiers and women, but of institutions and ideologies, of how war reshaped relationships and reduced them to mechanisms of survival and strategy. As we leave this chapter, we see how prostitution was not an accidental byproduct of the war, but a structured, regulated, and sometimes coerced reality. It was hidden from public discourse, yet deeply embedded in the daily life of soldiers and civilians alike. To understand the broader history of World War II, we must also understand these hidden rooms behind the front lines, where human need collided with military policy, and where the shadows of war and desire became official sanctioned parts of the conflict. Among the many systems of prostitution that emerged during the Second World War, none was more infamous, more widespread, and more devastating than the one established by the Japanese Imperial Army. Known euphemistically as the Comfort Women's System, it represented one of the largest organized structures of sexual exploitation in modern history. Behind the gentle name lay a brutal reality. Tens of thousands of women, perhaps even hundreds of thousands, were forced into service in so-called comfort stations, facilities set up across Asia wherever Japanese troops advanced. For those women, There was little comfort to be found, only coercion, confinement, and the enduring scars of a war that reached into their most private lives. The origins of the system date back to the early 1930s, when Japan, engaged in its wars of expansion in China, faced growing problems with its soldiers' conduct. Reports of widespread sexual assaults against civilians drew international criticism and threatened to undermine Japan's efforts to present itself as a disciplined power. To address these issues, military officials conceived of controlled brothels where soldiers could be directed, thereby reducing sexual violence against local populations, curbing the spread of venereal disease, and maintaining troop discipline. At least, that was the justification. In practice, the system became a massive mechanism of exploitation, sustained by deception, coercion, and violence. Recruitment into the comfort stations often began with lies. Young women from Korea, Taiwan, China, the Philippines, and other territories under Japanese control were told they would be offered good jobs, nurses, factory workers, or secretaries. Many came from poor families and saw these opportunities as a chance for stability. Only after they were transported far from home did the truth become clear. They were not workers in the conventional sense, but prisoners in a system of sexual slavery. Others were taken by force, seized from their villages by soldiers or police, with no pretense of choice. Once trapped within the system, escape was nearly impossible. Surrounded by guards, cut off from their communities, and threatened with violence, women had little control over their fate. Life inside the comfort stations was harsh beyond measure. Women were forced to serve multiple soldiers each day, sometimes dozens, with little rest and no ability to refuse. Medical inspections were routine and invasive, carried out not for the women's well-being, but to ensure they remained usable for the soldiers. Those who fell ill were often discarded, treated as broken tools rather than human beings. Violence was common, both physical and psychological, as the women were stripped of dignity and reduced to instruments of military necessity. In these spaces, intimacy was absent. What remained was survival, moment to moment, under conditions that tested the very limits of endurance. The scale of the system was staggering. Comfort stations were established across China, Korea, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands, following the Japanese military as it advanced. Wherever the army went, the system followed, a logistical extension of the war machine. The psychological impact was profound. For the women, the experience often left lifelong scars, trauma, shame, and silence that lingered long after the war ended. In many cases, survivors returned home unable or unwilling to speak of what had happened. Families, instead of offering comfort, sometimes turned them away, unable to accept what they had endured. In societies where purity and honor carried deep cultural weight, these women found themselves stigmatized, shunned, or forgotten. The silence was not only personal but collective, as entire nations struggled to confront the enormity of what had taken place within their borders. The Japanese military justified the system as a practical necessity, a way to maintain order and discipline. But behind the bureaucratic reasoning lay clear evidence of systemic abuse. The comfort women system was not a series of isolated incidents, but a carefully planned structure, organized at the highest levels of command. It reflected not only military pragmatism, but also the broader imperial ideology of domination, in which conquered peoples were seen as resources to be used. Women's bodies became another battlefield, another territory to be controlled, their suffering rendered invisible in the pursuit of victory. For decades after the war, the story of the comfort women remained largely hidden. Survivors bore their memories in silence, while official histories either ignored or denied the existence of the system. It was not until the late 20th century when elderly women from Korea, the Philippines, and elsewhere began to speak publicly that the truth gained wider recognition. Their testimonies broke decades of enforced silence, bringing to light the experiences that had been long suppressed. Standing before cameras and audiences, they told of their youth stolen, their dignity violated, and their future scarred. In doing so, they transformed themselves from forgotten victims into powerful witnesses, demanding acknowledgement and justice. The issue of the comfort women continues to resonate today, not only as a historical subject, but as a matter of international memory and politics. Disputes over acknowledgement, apology, and responsibility remain points of tension between Japan and its neighbors. Memorials have been built, protests continue, and the voices of survivors echo as reminders that history, once hidden, cannot be entirely erased. Their stories remind us that behind the official documents and military policies were human beings, young women who carried the weight of war in their bodies and minds. In reflecting on the comfort women system, we see the darkest side of official military brothels. What was presented as a solution to problems of discipline and order was, in truth, a machinery of exploitation, leaving behind wounds that generations continue to bear. It was a system where survival often meant silence, where suffering was hidden, and where the human spirit was tested in ways few can imagine. To remember this history is to honor those who endured it, to acknowledge the silence they were forced to carry, and to ensure that their voices, once ignored, continue to be heard. As we close this chapter, the story of the comfort women lingers as one of the most tragic examples of how war reshapes human life. It reminds us that behind every euphemism, behind every sanitized phrase, lies a reality that must be faced with honesty. The comfort women system was not about comfort, but about control, not about order, but about exploitation. In its shadow, we find the human cost of war laid bare, carried in the memories of those who lived through it, and in the silence of those who never returned. When the German Wehrmacht marched into foreign lands, they brought with them not only weapons and orders, but also a carefully structured system of regulation that extended into the most intimate corners of life. Among the many aspects of occupation was the establishment of military brothels, spaces created under official sanction where soldiers were directed to satisfy their desires under strict oversight. These institutions were not the result of casual indulgence, but deliberate policy, woven into the machinery of conquest and occupation. To understand the Wehrmacht's brothels is to see how ideology, control, and human need intersected in ways that reveal the complexities and cruelties of war. The rationale for these brothels was framed in terms of discipline and health. German military leaders feared the spread of venereal disease among their soldiers, which could weaken units and disrupt operations. They also feared disorder, worried that unchecked interactions between soldiers and civilians would lead to violence, chaos, or resistance. To prevent these risks, the Wehrmacht sought to create controlled environments where sexual encounters could occur under supervision. In their minds, it was a matter of efficiency and order, another logistical challenge to be solved in the vast machinery of war. Yet beneath this bureaucratic logic lay deeper layers of ideology, particularly the racial theories that defined Nazi thought. In the occupied territories, the organization of brothels was shaped by strict racial policies. German authorities established hierarchies of who could and could not be involved, reflecting the broader obsession with racial purity. In France, the Netherlands, and Western Europe, women recruited into brothels were often considered acceptable, at least in the eyes of Nazi racial ideology, provided they passed medical inspections. In Eastern Europe, however, the situation was different. Women from Poland, Ukraine, and Russia were frequently seen as racially inferior, and in many cases, German authorities sought to prevent close contact between them and German soldiers. Yet contradictions abounded. The demand for women was high, and ideology often bent beneath the weight of practicality. Despite restrictions, women from many occupied nations ended up in Wehrmacht brothels, some coerced, others compelled by poverty, and still others trapped by force. The experience of these women varied, but common threads ran through their stories. Medical examinations were routine and often demeaning, intended to protect soldiers rather than the women themselves. Rules were enforced to limit the amount of time a soldier could spend inside, ensuring a steady turnover and minimizing opportunities for personal attachment. Payments were made in money, cigarettes, or rations, reflecting the wartime economy where ordinary currency often lost its meaning. Some women entered out of desperation, trading their bodies for survival in a world where food was scarce and danger constant. Others had no choice at all, pressed into service by occupation authorities who saw them as expendable. The existence of Wehrmacht brothels also had political implications. By institutionalizing prostitution, the German authorities sent a signal of control, both to their own soldiers and to the occupied populations. For soldiers, the brothels provided a regulated outlet, reinforcing the idea that the state could manage even their private desires. For civilians, the brothels were a reminder of subjugation, of a world where even the most personal aspects of life were dictated by the occupiers. The sight of women entering and leaving such places carried social stigma, breeding whispers and judgments that could follow individuals long after the war ended. The brothel was not only a physical building, but a symbol of the power dynamic between conqueror and conquered. Not all German soldiers used these facilities. Some avoided them out of personal conviction, fear of disease, or lack of interest. Yet the very existence of this system shows how thoroughly the military sought to anticipate and control human behavior. Even those who did not participate were aware of the brothels, their presence an open secret within the army. Stories circulated in barracks, directions were passed discreetly, and the institution became part of the rhythm of military life. For many, it was simply another aspect of the strange normality that war imposed, where things once unthinkable became everyday realities. The end of the war did not erase these memories. For the women who endured them, the stigma lingered, often heavier than the hunger or poverty that had driven them into the system. Few spoke openly of their experiences, silenced by shame or fear of judgment. Communities, too, often chose silence, preferring not to confront the uncomfortable truths of collaboration, coercion, and survival. In the years that followed, the brothels of the Wehrmacht faded into the background of history, overshadowed by the larger narratives of battles and politics. Yet they remained a hidden wound, a reminder of how war invades even the most personal spaces of life. What is striking about the Wehrmacht brothels is how they illustrate the contradictions of Nazi ideology. On one hand, the regime preached racial purity, strict discipline, and moral superiority. On the other, it institutionalized systems that exploited women across Europe, bending its own rules when convenient. The gap between ideology and practice was wide, and in that gap, countless lives were altered, damaged, or destroyed. It is a reminder that war, even when wrapped in the language of order and efficiency, often conceals hypocrisy and cruelty beneath the surface. As we close this chapter, we see that the Wehrmacht brothels were more than places of fleeting encounters. They were institutions shaped by ideology, sustained by policy, and remembered with silence. They reveal the layers of control that war imposes, the compromises made in the name of discipline, and the human costs borne by those who had little choice. In their shadows, we find another piece of the hidden history of World War II, a history that continues to echo in the stories left untold. While the German and Japanese systems of military prostitution were vast, tightly controlled, and deeply rooted in ideology, the story of French and Allied brothels reveals a different side of the same phenomenon. Here, too, sex work became entwined with the war effort, but in ways shaped by France's colonial history, the cultural attitudes of different armies, and the practical realities of soldiers far from home. The brothels used by French troops and their allies were both official and unofficial, structured and improvised, tolerated and condemned, depending on the time, the place, and the needs of the men involved. What emerges is a picture of contradiction moral concerns clashing with pragmatic necessity, silence sitting uneasily beside acknowledgement. The French system of prostitution in the military had deep roots. Since the 19th century, the French army had maintained an organized network of regulated brothels known as Bordels Militaires de Campage, or BMCS. These establishments were viewed by military authorities not only as outlets for soldiers' desires, but as essential to maintaining health and discipline. When the Second World War began, the BMC system was revived and expanded, accompanying French colonial troops as they fought across North Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. For the French, prostitution was seen less as a moral problem and more as a logistical issue, something to be managed with the same attention as supplies and transport. Soldiers were directed to official brothels, where women were medically examined, encounters were timed, and rules were enforced with military precision. In North Africa, the system took on a particular character. Many of the women who worked in the BMCS, they were local, recruited from communities already shaped by colonial inequalities. French authorities rationalized the use of these women as a way to keep European women protected, while still meeting the needs of soldiers. The racial hierarchies of empire were reproduced within the brothels, where the bodies of colonized women were made available to troops in a context defined by power and domination. This dynamic highlighted how prostitution was never simply about intimacy or desire, but also about control, reflecting the broader structures of colonial rule. When France fell in 1940 and later regained its footing, the BMCS continued to operate under both Vichy and Free French forces. For soldiers, particularly those stationed in remote outposts, the brothel was seen as a part of daily life, unremarkable and expected. For the women, however, the experience was often one of exploitation, marked by poverty, limited choice, and the stigma that followed them long after the war ended. Even in cases where women entered voluntarily, economic desperation left them with few real alternatives. The brothel was, for many, less a place of profit than of survival. For the Allies, the approach to prostitution varied. The British Army, influenced by both pragmatic concerns and moral debates, tolerated prostitution in practice while rarely endorsing it openly. Soldiers stationed abroad encountered brothels in cities and towns, and while official policy discouraged visits, many officers quietly accepted them as inevitable. Medical concerns loomed large, and much effort was put into providing prophylactics and education rather than attempting outright prohibition. The result was a patchwork approach, sometimes restrictive, sometimes permissive, often inconsistent. The Americans, by contrast, entered the war with a stronger public stance against prostitution. U.S. military leaders framed it as a moral and health issue, warning soldiers against brothels and attempting to shut them down near bases. Yet the reality on the ground told a different story. In Britain, France, and Germany, American troops frequently encountered prostitution, whether through organized establishments or informal arrangements. Local economies, battered by war, often turned to sex work as a source of survival, and soldiers with money, rations, and goods became sought-after clients. Despite official disapproval, prostitution flourished around American bases, reminding us that policy and practice rarely aligned. In some cases, military police turned a blind eye. In others, local authorities facilitated encounters to keep order. The contradiction between public condemnation and private tolerance was never fully resolved. The British and Americans also grappled with the question of interracial encounters. In many parts of the world, especially where colonial troops or African American soldiers were stationed, local authorities worried about racial mixing in brothels. Restrictions were sometimes imposed to keep different groups separate, reflecting the racial anxieties of the time. These rules highlighted how prostitution was not only a matter of intimacy, but also of politics, tied to broader concerns about hierarchy, identity, and social order. In the brothels, as on the battlefield, the fault lines of race, class, and power were exposed. In liberated France, prostitution took on new meanings. As American, British, and Canadian soldiers arrived, local women engaged in sex work both through official channels and in more informal ways. The shortages of food, clothing, and money made such arrangements a means of survival for many. Cigarettes, chocolate, and nylon stockings became currency, traded as much for their symbolic value as for their material worth. For some soldiers, encounters with French women became a symbol of liberation, an affirmation of victory and freedom. For others, it was simply a matter of opportunity. For the women, however, the story was often more complicated, bound up with necessity, vulnerability, and the risk of judgment. After the war, women who had been associated with foreign soldiers, whether as prostitutes, lovers, or collaborators, were often stigmatized, their hair shaved in public rituals of humiliation that reflected the tensions of post-war society. In reflecting on French and Allied brothels, we see a web of contradictions. On one hand, prostitution was condemned, stigmatized, and denied. On the other, it was tolerated, organized, and relied upon. It was both hidden and visible, both forbidden and inevitable. Soldiers sought it, women endured it, and societies lived with it, even as they pretended otherwise. The BMCS of France and the unofficial networks around Allied bases remind us that war reshapes not only battlefields, but also the most private aspects of life, pulling them into the orbit of necessity and survival. As we close this chapter, we are left with the recognition that prostitution during the war was not confined to one side, one army, or one ideology. Whether in the official brothels of the French, the tolerated establishments of the British, or the shadow networks around American bases, the story was always present, always intertwined with the larger conflict. It is a reminder that war does not suspend human need, but amplifies it, channeling it into forms that are at once intimate and political, personal and collective. In these spaces, hidden behind closed doors yet known to all, another chapter of the war unfolded, one carried not in headlines, but in the quiet exchanges of survival. Even with the existence of official brothels, military oversight, and regulated systems, the reality of war gave rise to another, far less controlled world of prostitution, the underground economy of desire. In every occupied city, every garrison town, and every camp where soldiers gathered, there emerged a black market that met needs unaddressed by official policy. It was in these hidden corners, darkened streets, makeshift rooms, quiet agreements whispered in markets, that another story unfolded, one that was less about military organization and more about human survival. Here, desperation shaped transactions, and intimacy became a form of currency in the harshest of economies. The black market of desire existed for many reasons. Some soldiers found official brothels unappealing, either too impersonal, too restrictive, or too heavily monitored. Others were stationed in areas where no military establishments existed, leaving them to seek alternatives on their own. Civilians, meanwhile, often had little choice but to turn to sex work as a means of survival. With food scarce, money devalued, and markets unstable, the human body became one of the few resources left to trade. In these encounters, the exchange was not always cash. It might be a loaf of bread, a bar of chocolate, a pair of shoes, or even a promise of protection. The currency of survival was flexible, shaped by need and opportunity. In occupied cities such as Paris, Warsaw, and Rome, prostitution thrived in hidden ways despite official attempts at regulation. Cafes and nightclubs often served as fronts where soldiers and civilians mingled, and arrangements were quietly made. Some women operated independently, taking risks in order to maintain a measure of autonomy, while others were drawn into networks controlled by pimps or black market organizers who profited from their vulnerability. The risks were immense. Without the medical oversight of official brothels, disease spread more easily. Encounters could turn violent, with little recourse for protection or justice. Yet for many, the alternative was starvation, and survival outweighed safety. The underground economy was also shaped by inequality. Women in occupied territories often had little bargaining power, forced to accept whatever terms soldiers imposed. For those with children or elderly relatives to care for, the desperation was even greater. Some women were driven into prostitution after their husbands were killed or taken prisoner, left without support in a collapsing economy. For others, the decision was less about choice and more about coercion, as local collaborators or occupying forces pressured them into service. In this way, the black market blurred the line between voluntary and forced participation, creating a gray zone where survival and exploitation became nearly indistinguishable. Not all participants in the black market were women. Men, too, found themselves engaged in sex work, though their stories were less often recorded. In occupied cities, male prostitution existed quietly, often hidden beneath layers of taboo and stigma. Soldiers, separated from families and living in conditions of constant strain, sometimes sought out male partners in secret. These encounters, rarely acknowledged in official histories, remind us that the underground world of desire was more diverse than the records suggest, encompassing a wide spectrum of human interactions suppressed by the moral standards of the time. The black market of desire was also a site of power exchange. Soldiers held the advantage, armed not only with weapons, but with access to food, supplies, and protection. Civilians, stripped of these essentials, often had little choice but to comply. Yet there were moments, too, when civilians exercised their own forms of resistance, setting terms, negotiating exchanges, or refusing outright. These acts of agency, though small, mattered, for they represented the effort to retain dignity in a world that had stripped so much away. The black market was thus not only a place of exploitation, but also a place where individuals carved out space to survive, to negotiate, and to endure. The Allies, too, encountered and participated in these underground economies. As American and British soldiers entered liberated cities, they were greeted not only as saviors, but also as potential sources of food, money, and goods. Civilians, impoverished by years of war, often turned to sex work as one of the few avenues of survival. In return, soldiers offered items that symbolized abundance in a time of scarcity: cigarettes, canned goods. These transactions blurred the lines between intimacy, survival, and gratitude, creating complex relationships that could not be reduced to simple terms of exploitation or consent. In many ways, the black market of desire reflected the larger black markets that flourished during the war. Just as food, fuel, and clothing were traded outside official channels, so too were moments of intimacy. The state could regulate, punish, and deny, but it could not extinguish the human need for connection or the desperation born of hunger. Where official systems ended, unofficial ones sprang up, filling the void with arrangements that were often hidden, dangerous, and deeply personal. The legacy of these underground economies lingered long after the war. For many women, the stigma of participation remained, regardless of whether their choices had been voluntary or forced. Communities, eager to restore order, often turned against them, branding them as collaborators or outcasts. Families kept silent, and survivors carried memories that were rarely shared. The black market of desire, though hidden in its time, left marks that shaped lives for decades to come. As we close this chapter, we see how the unofficial world of prostitution during the war was as important as the official one. It was here, in the dimly lit rooms and quiet exchanges, that survival was negotiated day by day. The black market reminds us that war reshapes not only nations and armies, but also the smallest details of human life, creating economies where intimacy itself becomes a commodity. In these hidden spaces, desire was not only about pleasure, but about endurance, survival, and the fragile hope of making it through another day. Among the many landscapes transformed by war, occupied France holds a particular place in the story of wartime prostitution. When German troops entered Paris in June 1940, they brought not only the weight of military rule, but also a hunger for comfort, distraction, and intimacy. Overnight, the rhythms of daily life in France were reshaped, and prostitution became woven into the complex fabric of occupation. For some, it was a matter of survival; for others, a matter of coercion; and for many, it was a subject of silence and stigma that lingered long after the war ended. To understand prostitution in occupied France is to understand how war blurs the lines between collaboration, resistance, necessity, and exploitation. The German authorities approached prostitution in France with a blend of control and pragmatism. Brothels were quickly placed under military supervision, as they had been elsewhere in occupied Europe. Medical checks were made mandatory, not for the sake of the women's health, but to protect soldiers from venereal disease. Some brothels were designated exclusively for German use, while others remained open to civilians, but under strict oversight. In Paris, the famed maisons closes, with their red lights and discreet entrances, became hubs where German officers mingled with French women in an atmosphere of tension and unease. What had once been a part of urban nightlife was now reshaped by occupation, infused with the power dynamics of conqueror and conquered. For many French women, survival under occupation meant difficult choices. Food shortages, unemployment, and the absence of men who had been taken prisoner or killed left families in dire straits. Prostitution, whether in brothels or on the streets, became one of the few means of survival. Some women entered the trade voluntarily, seeking the means to feed their children or to secure scarce goods. Others were coerced, pressured by authorities, intermediaries, or circumstance into servicing the occupiers. The transaction was rarely simple. It was not only money that changed hands, but rations, cigarettes, clothing, and even promises of protection. In a society stripped of stability, intimacy became another form of currency. The stigma attached to prostitution under occupation was heavy, compounded by the perception of collaboration. To be seen with a German soldier was to invite judgment, whispers, and suspicion. For women, the line between survival and betrayal was thin, and communities were often quick to condemn those who crossed it. After liberation, this stigma erupted into acts of public humiliation. Women accused of horizontal collaboration, whether prostitutes, lovers of German soldiers, or those merely suspected, were paraded through the streets, their heads shaved, their reputations destroyed. These scenes, witnessed across towns and cities, reflected the deep wounds left by occupation, where personal choices made under duress became public spectacles of judgment. Yet the story of prostitution in occupied France was not only one of shame. It was also a story of resistance in unexpected forms. Some women who worked in brothels used their position to gather intelligence, passing information to the French resistance or to Allied spies. Their proximity to German soldiers, while seen by many as collaboration, sometimes became a cover for clandestine activity. In this way, prostitution could be both a symbol of subjugation and a tool of resistance. Though the risks were immense, discovery meant imprisonment, torture, or death. Still, for some, the brothel became a battlefield of a different kind, where information and survival were exchanged alongside intimacy. The German soldiers themselves varied in their approach to French prostitution. Some sought out brothels as a matter of routine, following orders to use regulated establishments rather than risking disease in unofficial encounters. Others formed relationships with local women, whether genuine or transactional, further blurring the lines between occupation and intimacy. Letters, diaries, and post-war testimonies reveal that for some soldiers, these encounters were remembered with fondness or longing, while for the women, they often left only pain and stigma. The imbalance of power ensured that true consent was rare, for even seemingly voluntary relationships took place in a context defined by coercion and occupation. The French authorities, under the Vichy regime, also played a role in regulating prostitution during the occupation. Keen to maintain order and to avoid harsher German interventions, they often cooperated in organizing medical checks and oversight of brothels. This collaboration added another layer of complexity, as French officials found themselves complicit in sustaining an institution that both exploited women and served the occupiers. It was a reminder that the boundaries between resistance, collaboration, and survival were often blurred, shaped as much by necessity as by ideology. When liberation came in 1944, the brothels of occupied France did not simply vanish. The women who had worked in them faced uncertain futures, burdened by stigma and silence. Some were punished as collaborators, others sought to rebuild their lives in anonymity, and still others remained trapped in the trade by poverty and lack of options. Society, eager to celebrate liberation, often turned its harshest judgment on these women, using them as symbols of humiliation, while ignoring the broader structures of exploitation that had shaped their choices. In the rush to restore dignity and pride, the complexities of survival were flattened into simplistic narratives of betrayal. To reflect on prostitution in occupied France is to confront the many contradictions of wartime life. It was at once a means of survival and a source of shame, a symbol of collaboration, and at times a tool of resistance. It was tolerated by occupiers, regulated by authorities, and condemned by communities. Yet beneath all of these layers were individual lives, shaped by hunger, fear, and the relentless need to endure. The brothels and streets of occupied France remind us that history is not only written in battles and treaties, but also in the quiet transactions of survival, hidden in plain sight, yet deeply woven into the fabric of war. As we close this chapter, the image of occupied France lingers. Streets dimly lit under curfew, cafes filled with whispers, and women navigating choices that were not choices at all. Their stories, often silenced by shame, form a vital part of the hidden history of World War II, revealing the intimate ways in which occupation reshaped not only nations, but the most personal aspects of human existence. If the Western Front revealed prostitution as an uneasy mix of survival, collaboration, and regulation, the Eastern Front exposed an even harsher reality. Here, in the vast stretches of land between Germany and the Soviet Union, the war was fought with a brutality unlike anything seen elsewhere. Cities were burned, villages were destroyed, and millions were displaced. Within this violent landscape, prostitution took on forms that were raw, desperate, and often indistinguishable from survival sex or outright sexual violence. The Eastern Front was a place where the normal rules of society collapsed, and in the ruins, human need and human cruelty intertwined in ways that defy simple explanation. For German soldiers advancing into the Soviet Union, the policies of occupation were rooted in ideology as much as military necessity. The Nazi regime viewed Slavic peoples as racially inferior, unworthy of equal treatment. This ideology shaped every aspect of occupation, including the regulation of intimacy. Official Wehrmacht brothels existed in some towns, often staffed by women coerced or recruited from local populations. But the racial hierarchy meant that these establishments were restricted in who could participate. Soldiers were sometimes directed to avoid relations with Slavic women, yet the reality of war made such prohibitions hollow. Desire and desperation, combined with the imbalance of power, meant that encounters occurred regardless of rules, often in ways that blurred the lines between prostitution, coercion, and assault. For the women of the Eastern Front, survival was a daily struggle. Food was scarce, homes destroyed, and families torn apart. Many women, left without husbands, brothers, or fathers, faced starvation for themselves and their children. In this environment, prostitution emerged as a form of survival sex. Women exchanged intimacy for bread, for a can of soup, for protection from soldiers who might otherwise harm them. These transactions, while sometimes described as voluntary, carried little of the agency implied by the word. They were choices made under duress, with survival hanging in the balance. In this sense, prostitution on the Eastern Front was less a profession than a desperate adaptation to unimaginable circumstances. The Soviet side of the conflict brought its own complexities. Soviet soldiers, advancing westward after 1943, carried with them both the scars of immense suffering and the power of victory. In liberated territories, reports of sexual violence were widespread, with countless civilians subjected to abuse. Within this context, prostitution also appeared, as women sought to protect themselves or their families by entering into arrangements with soldiers. Sometimes it was a matter of exchanging sex for food or safety. Other times it was a grim strategy to avoid worse forms of violence. These stories, rarely told in official Soviet narratives, reveal the profound human costs of war, hidden beneath the triumphalist accounts of liberation. The Eastern Front also saw prostitution emerge around prisoner of war and labor camps. In some cases, brothels were established near camps, staffed by women coerced from occupied populations. Prisoners themselves, stripped of autonomy and desperate for survival, sometimes witnessed these arrangements, their presence a cruel reminder of the dehumanization that permeated every aspect of the conflict. In other cases, women in nearby villages were pressured into servicing soldiers in exchange for protection from reprisals. The presence of prostitution in these contexts underscores how war dismantled ordinary boundaries, leaving only survival as the guiding principle. The scale of violence on the Eastern Front made prostitution particularly difficult to separate from coercion. Unlike the regulated brothels of Western Europe, where at least some structure existed, the Eastern Front was a place of chaos, where front lines shifted rapidly and armies swept through territories with little regard for stability. In this shifting landscape, prostitution often meant moments of negotiation in the shadow of violence. For women, the options were few. Refusal could mean assault, imprisonment, or death, while compliance offered a fragile chance at survival. These were not choices in the conventional sense, but strategies of endurance in a world where survival was never guaranteed. For the soldiers, encounters on the Eastern Front were shaped by ideology, opportunity, and the relentless strain of war. Some followed orders and avoided contact, others sought out women in brothels or villages, and still others used their power to coerce or force. Letters and diaries reveal a wide range of experiences, from crude boasts to quiet admissions of shame. What they have in common is the way intimacy was distorted by the violence of war, reduced to transactions or acts of domination rather than moments of human connection. After the war, the stories of prostitution on the Eastern Front were rarely spoken aloud. In Germany, the focus on defeat and guilt left little room to discuss the complexities of intimacy in occupied territories. In the Soviet Union, official silence was even more pronounced. To admit that prostitution or sexual violence occurred would have contradicted the narrative of heroic liberation, and so these stories remained hidden. Women who had survived through prostitution were often left to bear their memories in silence, stigmatized by society and ignored by history. What makes the Eastern Front particularly haunting is the scale of suffering that framed every encounter. Here, prostitution was not only about desire or regulation, but about survival in the midst of total war. It was shaped by hunger, ideology, violence, and the constant presence of death. To speak of prostitution on the Eastern Front is to acknowledge the resilience of those who endured, but also to confront the cruelty of a system that left so few choices. The Eastern Front leaves us with images of devastation, villages in ashes, cities in ruins, and lives caught between survival and annihilation. Within that destruction, prostitution appeared not as choice, but as endurance, a fragile thread woven into the chaos of war. And now, with these shadows in mind, we turn toward another place where intimacy and survival collided, the camps themselves. The world of prisoner of war and labor camps during the Second World War was already one of unimaginable suffering. Starvation, disease, overcrowding, and forced labor stripped individuals of dignity and hope, reducing life to the most basic struggle for survival. Within this environment of cruelty, another layer of exploitation unfolded: the presence of prostitution, often coerced, often hidden, yet undeniably present. Whether sanctioned by authorities or emerging informally, sex work in and around camps became a grim reminder of how deeply war penetrated into the private spaces of human existence, reshaping intimacy into yet another tool of power and survival. German authorities, particularly the SS, established brothels within certain concentration and labor camps. These brothels were not designed for the benefit of the prisoners themselves, but for selected groups deemed privileged or useful to the regime. In camps like Auschwitz and Buchenwald, brothels were created in an attempt to motivate male prisoners to work harder, offering the promise of brief access as a reward for labor or obedience. The women who staffed these brothels were usually drawn from other camps, often coerced under threat of death, transferred from the ranks of female prisoners with the false promise of better treatment. For many, agreeing to such work meant only exchanging one form of torment for another, their lives controlled entirely by the camp system. The conditions in these camp brothels were horrific. Women lived under constant surveillance, their movements strictly controlled, their bodies subject to repeated examinations and abuse. Encounters were scheduled, timed, and monitored, stripping intimacy of any personal meaning. For the men who were permitted entry, participation was often tainted by shame and fear, for the system was designed not only to exploit women, but also to manipulate prisoners, binding them more tightly to the structures of the camp. Far from a place of comfort, these brothels were extensions of oppression, where human lives were reduced to instruments in the machinery of war. Outside the formal brothels, prostitution also appeared in less organized ways around prisoner of war camps. Civilians living nearby, themselves struggling with shortages and poverty, sometimes entered into arrangements with guards or even prisoners, exchanging intimacy for food, protection, or goods. In some cases, women were pressured or coerced by local collaborators, their vulnerability exploited in the shadow of the camps. These encounters, though less formally documented, reveal how the economy of survival extended beyond the barbed wire, touching not only the prisoners within, but also the civilians living under occupation. In the Soviet Union, German POs after 1945 sometimes encountered similar dynamics, though in a different context. Prisoners, facing years of forced labor and deprivation, occasionally entered into relationships, some coerced, some transactional, with local women in the villages near camps. The desperation of post-war life blurred the lines between survival and exploitation, leaving legacies that were seldom discussed, but quietly remembered by those who lived them. The camp, even when no longer filled with barbed wire and guards, continued to shape the possibilities of human intimacy. The role of prostitution in POW and labor camps forces us to confront some of the most uncomfortable aspects of war. It reveals how systems of total control sought to manipulate even the most personal aspects of life. It also reminds us that in conditions of extreme deprivation, survival could push individuals into choices they would never otherwise consider. For the women coerced into camp brothels, the stigma often remained long after liberation. Many survivors chose never to speak of their experiences, fearing judgment from families and communities that could not or would not understand. Their silence was another form of imprisonment, stretching far beyond the walls of the camp. For the men, too, the legacy was complex. Some carried guilt for having participated, knowing that their brief moments of reward came at the expense of women who suffered alongside them. Others refused outright, rejecting the manipulation of the system even at personal cost. Diaries, testimonies, and oral histories reveal a wide spectrum of responses, but all point to the same conclusion. The presence of prostitution in camps was not about desire or pleasure, but about control, coercion, and survival under the most extreme conditions. The very existence of these camp brothels challenges the way we think about war. They show that even in the darkest environments, where death and suffering define daily life, human intimacy could be twisted into yet another weapon of domination. They reveal the cruelty of regimes that saw nothing as off-limits, not even the most private dimensions of human existence. And they remind us of the resilience of those who endured, surviving experiences that defy comprehension. The brothels and hidden exchanges within the camps remind us how war invaded every corner of existence, even where hope seemed almost extinguished. These silences and scars endure as some of the darkest memories of the conflict. From here, we step into another layer of this story, the medical gaze that sought to control bodies in the name of discipline. Beneath the surface of military brothels, underground economies, and the private arrangements forged in wartime, there ran a current of constant anxiety disease. For armies waging campaigns across continents, venereal disease represented not only a health issue, but also a potential military crisis. A soldier incapacitated by illness was a soldier lost to the front, and when multiplied across thousands, infections threatened the efficiency and effectiveness of entire units. In this context, prostitution was viewed by military planners not solely as a moral or social problem, but as a medical one, demanding surveillance, intervention, and control. Thus, the medical side of wartime prostitution became an essential, if uncomfortable, part of the machinery of war. The German Wehrmacht, like other armies, placed great emphasis on regulating the health of soldiers who visited brothels. Military doctors carried out regular examinations of the women who staffed these establishments, ensuring that they remained fit for service. These examinations were often invasive, degrading, and performed with little regard for the women's well-being. The purpose was not to protect the women, but to safeguard the men, treating the female body as a potential vector of disease rather than as a life worthy of care. Soldiers themselves were sometimes subject to mandatory checkups after visiting brothels, and in many cases, the use of condoms was either encouraged or required. Medical officers kept careful records, blending intimacy with bureaucracy in a way that stripped encounters of privacy and dignity. The Japanese Imperial Army pursued similar measures in its comfort stations. Women were subjected to constant medical checks, their bodies monitored with clinical detachment. Those found to be infected were often cast aside, replaced by others in a system that valued their health only in terms of utility. The focus was always on the fighting force, never on the individuals coerced into service. This emphasis on medical regulation reflected the broader logic of the war. Human bodies reduced to resources, measured not by their humanity, but by their usefulness to the military machine. The Allies, though often more reluctant to sanction official brothels, also treated venereal disease as a major threat. The U.S. military, in particular, launched extensive campaigns warning soldiers of the dangers of infection. Posters, lectures, and training materials hammered home the message: disease was the enemy, and careless encounters could cripple the war effort. Condoms were widely distributed, sometimes even made mandatory in certain contexts. Medical units were instructed to treat infections quickly and efficiently, returning soldiers to the front as soon as possible. Here, too, the focus was pragmatic. It was not morality that drove these measures, but the relentless need to keep armies in fighting condition. In Britain, similar efforts unfolded. Soldiers were cautioned against casual encounters, and public health campaigns emphasized the dangers of venereal disease. The tension between prohibition and tolerance was evident. While prostitution was officially discouraged, the reality of its persistence meant that practical steps had to be taken to mitigate risk. The result was a hybrid approach: warnings, prophylactics, and treatment centers, all aimed at minimizing the impact of disease on the war effort. Medical pragmatism often won out over moral idealism, reflecting the brutal logic of total war. For the women involved, the medical side of prostitution was often a source of additional suffering. Examinations were invasive, performed under duress, and carried out with little compassion. Those who tested positive for infection were frequently cast aside, deprived of income or protection, left to survive on their own. In some cases, women were confined in hospitals or locked away until deemed safe again. The stigma of disease compounded the stigma of prostitution, trapping women in cycles of shame and vulnerability that extended far beyond the war years. For many, the medical gaze of the military reduced their lives to numbers on a chart, erasing their humanity in favor of statistics. The language used in medical reports and policies further underscores this dehumanization. Women were described not as individuals, but as sources of infection or risks to morale. The emphasis was always on control, surveillance, and elimination of danger. Rarely, if ever, did the documents acknowledge the suffering of the women themselves, or the conditions that had driven them into prostitution. Instead, they were folded into the apparatus of war, their health monitored only insofar as it affected the performance of soldiers. The medical side also shaped the experiences of soldiers themselves. Fear of disease hung heavily over encounters, casting a shadow over the promise of intimacy. Posters warned of enemy agents in the form of infected women, framing disease as another weapon in the arsenal of the enemy. Soldiers were told that carelessness could bring shame, weakness, or even death. In this way, venereal disease was not only a medical issue, but also a moral one, folded into broader narratives of discipline, masculinity, and duty. The body of the soldier was to be guarded not only against bullets and bombs, but against the hidden dangers of desire. After the war, the medical legacies of these systems persisted. Many women carried untreated infections for years, their health permanently damaged. Others bore the stigma of disease long after the guns had fallen silent. The emphasis on control, rather than care, left scars that were rarely acknowledged, hidden in the silence of post-war societies. For soldiers, too, the fear of disease shaped their memories of wartime encounters, often coloring their reflections with regret, guilt, or unease. The medical side of wartime prostitution thus left traces that extended far beyond the battlefield, shaping lives in ways that were seldom spoken of. As we close this chapter, we are reminded that war touches every aspect of human existence, even the most intimate. In the medicalization of prostitution, we see how desire was transformed into a matter of statistics, how human bodies became resources to be managed, and how survival was measured not in compassion, but in efficiency. The medical side of wartime prostitution reveals the extent to which war corrodes boundaries, turning even the private realm of intimacy into another battlefield, where control and survival eclipsed humanity itself. To understand prostitution during the Second World War, one must also see it through the lens of economics. War disrupted markets, destroyed livelihoods, and created shortages so severe that ordinary forms of exchange often broke down. In this shattered landscape, sex became not only a matter of intimacy, but also a form of currency, traded for money, rations, cigarettes, chocolate, or safety. The economics of wartime prostitution were complex, reflecting both the desperation of civilians and the relative power of soldiers who carried not just weapons, but also the resources of survival. In many ways, prostitution became a mirror of the wartime economy itself, scarce, improvised, and shaped by inequality. In occupied Europe, official currencies lost much of their value. Inflation, shortages, and rationing meant that francs, zlotys, or lira could no longer guarantee food on the table. What mattered were the goods controlled by soldiers and occupying authorities: bread, canned meat, soap, cigarettes, and fuel. These items became the true currency of war, and prostitution became one of the ways women could access them. For a single loaf of bread, a bar of chocolate, or a packet of American cigarettes, a woman might provide services that in peacetime would have commanded much higher prices. This exchange was not about wealth, but about survival, a brutal economy where human need dictated the terms. For the soldiers, particularly those from wealthier or better supplied armies, this imbalance gave them enormous power. American G's, flush with resources compared to starving civilians in France, Italy, or Germany, often became walking symbols of abundance. Chocolate, chewing gum, nylon stockings, and cigarettes became tokens of exchange, valued as much for their symbolic promise of prosperity as for their material worth. For local women, these goods offered not only sustenance, but also a glimpse of hope, a reminder of a world beyond scarcity. The economics of prostitution thus intertwined with the psychology of survival, where small luxuries carried outsized meaning. In German-occupied territories, the economy of prostitution often operated through official brothels, where payments were regulated and monitored. Soldiers paid fees, sometimes in local currency, sometimes in occupation-issued scrip, while the women received only a fraction of the proceeds. Much of the profit was siphoned off by intermediaries, pimps, brothel keepers, or even the military authorities themselves. In this way, prostitution became not only a personal transaction, but also a source of revenue, folded into the larger machinery of occupation. The economics were exploitative by design, reinforcing the imbalance of power between conqueror and conquered. In the Japanese comfort stations, money often played an even smaller role. Women were coerced into service with little or no compensation, their labor extracted as a form of slavery rather than exchange. Where payments were made, they were often symbolic or withheld entirely, leaving women with nothing once the war ended. The economic side of the comfort women system reveals its true nature, not a profession, but an institution of exploitation where the bodies of women were consumed without recognition of their humanity or labor. For survivors, the absence of payment added to the difficulty of post-war acknowledgement, for they were denied not only dignity, but also restitution. The underground economies of prostitution were more fluid. In the streets, alleys, and hidden rooms of occupied cities, women set prices not in cash, but in goods. A tin of condensed milk, a warm coat, or a few pieces of bread could mean the difference between survival and starvation. Sometimes exchanges were made not for food, but for safety and agreement with a soldier or officer that offered protection from raids, deportation, or violence. In these cases, prostitution was less about money and more about negotiating power in a world where civilians held very little. The economics of intimacy became the economics of survival, where every choice was shaped by scarcity and fear. For women who engaged in prostitution, the earnings were rarely enough to escape poverty. At best, they offered a temporary reprieve, a few days of food, or a slightly warmer winter. At worst, they brought stigma, disease, and further exploitation. Yet in the shattered economies of wartime, these exchanges could not be dismissed as trivial. They were part of the broader fabric of survival, reflecting the lengths to which people would go to endure the unendurable. For many, the choice was stark: sell intimacy or face starvation. In that sense, prostitution was as much a part of the war economy as black market trading, smuggling, or scavenging. The economics also extended beyond the war itself. After liberation, women associated with prostitution or with foreign soldiers often faced public shaming, their survival strategies recast as betrayal. Few recognized the economic desperation that had driven those choices. Instead, they were punished, ostracized, or humiliated, their economic survival transformed into social stigma. The imbalance of wartime economics thus carried over into peacetime, leaving scars that endured long after the guns had fallen silent. What emerges from this picture is the realization that prostitution during the war cannot be separated from the larger economies of scarcity and survival. It was not only about desire, but about rations, not only about money, but about safety. It was shaped by the good soldiers carried in their packs, the shortages civilians faced, and the desperation that hung over occupied territories. In these exchanges, intimacy became another commodity, one shaped by the brutal arithmetic of war. To speak of the economics of prostitution is to speak of survival itself, measured not in wealth or luxury, but in the simple act of enduring another day. The fragile exchanges of bread for survival or chocolate for comfort reveal how scarcity transformed intimacy into currency. These quiet markets remind us that survival had its own price, measured day by day. And so, from coins and rations, we now turn to the most fragile yet powerful element of all women's voices. Up to this point, we have spoken of systems, policies, armies, and economies, but at the heart of the story of wartime prostitution lie the voices of women themselves. These voices, when they emerge, carry with them the weight of silence, stigma, and trauma. They remind us that behind every policy, behind every clandestine transaction, and behind every official brothel or hidden room was a human being with hopes, fears, and memories. To hear their voices is to step closer to the reality of war as it was lived, not merely as it was written in reports or remembered in military archives. For decades, most of these voices were silent. The stigma of prostitution, compounded by the trauma of coercion or exploitation, left many women unable or unwilling to speak of their experiences. Some carried their memories alone for the rest of their lives, choosing silence over the risk of judgment. Others tried to share, but found their stories dismissed, doubted, or ignored. It was only in the later decades of the 20th century that survivors of systems, such as the Japanese comfort stations, began to speak publicly, breaking through layers of denial and silence. Their testimonies, often given in old age, became powerful reminders of the hidden histories that lived on in private memory long after the war ended. The testimonies of comfort women stand among the most powerful voices of this history. Women from Korea, China, the Philippines, and other occupied territories described how they were deceived or abducted, how they were transported to distant stations, and how they were forced to serve dozens of men a day under conditions of surveillance and abuse. Their words, often trembling with emotion, carried the weight of decades of silence. "We were not women anymore. We were machines," one survivor recalled, capturing the dehumanization that defined their daily existence. These voices, once hidden, have since become central to the historical understanding of wartime exploitation, demanding recognition not only from historians, but from the governments that once denied them. In Europe, the voices of women who engaged in prostitution under occupation or in the context of official brothels are more fragmentary, but they, too, reveal the complexity of survival. Some spoke of choices made reluctantly, trading intimacy for food to keep children alive. Others described being coerced by authorities, pressured by poverty, or caught in situations where refusal was not an option. A few admitted to entering the trade more willingly, drawn by the relative security or small luxuries it offered in a time of deprivation. These voices resist simple categorization, reminding us that each life was shaped by its own circumstances, and that survival in war rarely fits into clear moral boxes. Women's voices also reveal the deep scars left by stigma. Those who returned to their communities often found themselves judged more harshly than the soldiers who had participated. In France, women accused of relationships with German soldiers, whether prostitutes, lovers, or even those merely suspected, were humiliated in public after liberation, their heads shaved as crowds jeered. Survivors of brothels in Germany and Poland carried shame that made it nearly impossible to rebuild their lives. For many, the war never truly ended, for its consequences lived on in silence, shame, and the fear of exposure. Their voices, when heard, often carry the pain not only of what happened during the war, but of what happened afterward, when society refused to understand. Yet among these testimonies are also moments of resilience. Some women spoke of small acts of defiance, refusing certain clients, protecting fellow prisoners, or secretly passing information to resistance fighters. Others recalled how they created communities of solidarity with one another, sharing food, comforting one another, and offering what strength they could. These stories complicate the image of women as passive victims, revealing instead the resilience of individuals who endured extraordinary circumstances with dignity, courage, and determination. Their voices remind us that even in the darkest places, humanity persists. For historians, gathering these voices has been both essential and challenging. Oral histories, interviews, and memoirs provide glimpses into experiences otherwise erased from the record. Yet they are often fragmented, shaped by the passage of time and the difficulty of speaking about trauma. Some survivors recall details with painful clarity, while others struggled to put their memories into words. The act of speaking itself, after decades of silence, was an act of courage. Each testimony adds to a collective mosaic, piecing together a story that no archive or official report could ever fully capture. It is also important to recognize the silences that remain. For every woman who spoke, there are countless others who never did. Some passed away without ever telling their families what they endured. Others chose to bury the memories so deeply that they could never be voiced. These silences, too, are part of the history, for they speak to the weight of stigma, the burden of shame, and the profound difficulty of articulating experiences that defy comprehension. To honor the voices we have is also to respect the silences, acknowledging that absence itself carries meaning. As we listen to women's voices from the war, we are called to reframe our understanding of history. War is often told through the language of battles, leaders, and strategies, but these testimonies remind us that it was also lived in the quiet, hidden spaces of survival and endurance. The voices of women cut through the abstraction of policy and ideology, grounding us in the human cost of war. They tell us not only what happened, but how it felt, how it was endured, and how it was remembered or forgotten in the years that followed. Their words, trembling yet enduring, continue to echo even when silence surrounds them. Each story, spoken or withheld, is part of the truth of this war. And with these voices still in our ears, we move into the questions of morality and the policies that sought and failed to contain them. Throughout the Second World War, prostitution existed in a constant state of tension between morality and pragmatism. On one side, military leaders and governments wrestled with questions of discipline, public image, and moral authority. On the other, they faced the undeniable reality of human desire, loneliness, and the dangers posed by uncontrolled sexual encounters. This tension gave rise to a series of contradictory policies, sometimes prohibiting, sometimes permitting, and sometimes quietly ignoring prostitution, each shaped by the specific needs of armies and the cultures from which they came. To study this balance is to glimpse how morality bent beneath the weight of war, and how policy was often less about ideals than about maintaining control. The German Wehrmacht's approach revealed this contradiction most clearly. Official ideology, rooted in Nazi racial theories, condemned relationships between German soldiers and women considered racially inferior. Yet in practice, brothels were established across occupied Europe, staffed by local women who were sometimes coerced, sometimes compelled by hunger, and always subject to strict medical oversight. Morality was subordinated to control. Soldiers were directed towards sanctioned establishments, their choices restricted not by principle, but by racial and medical concerns. The very existence of these brothels exposed the hypocrisy of Nazi ideology, which preached purity while institutionalizing exploitation. For the regime, the priority was not morality, but efficiency, ensuring soldiers remained healthy, disciplined, and loyal to the war effort. The Japanese Imperial Army confronted similar contradictions. Publicly, the regime claimed that its comfort stations were necessary to maintain order, protect civilians from assault, and preserve the honor of the military. Privately, these institutions served as instruments of control, coercion, and exploitation. The moral language of protection masked the reality of abuse, while the insistence on discipline obscured the suffering of countless women forced into sexual slavery. Here, morality became a tool of justification, deployed to mask policies that were anything but moral. The comfort stations stand as one of the starkest examples of how war can twist language, turning words like protection and comfort into euphemisms for violence. The Allies, too, faced their own struggles with morality and policy. The U.S. military officially condemned prostitution, framing it as both a moral danger and a health threat. Commanders issued orders forbidding soldiers from visiting brothels, and campaigns were launched to warn against venereal disease. Yet beneath the surface, enforcement was uneven, and in many cases, authorities turned a blind eye. Soldiers in Britain, France, and the Pacific encountered prostitution regularly, and while officials decried it in speeches and pamphlets, they often tolerated it in practice. A contradiction was obvious. Policy said one thing, but necessity dictated another. What mattered most was not morality, but the preservation of combat readiness. And when soldiers sought out intimacy, discipline often yielded to pragmatism. The British response was equally complex. While the government discouraged prostitution, recognizing its potential to spread disease and cause scandal, it also recognized the futility of outright prohibition. Instead, efforts were channeled into medical prevention, providing condoms, treatment centers, and education, while prostitution itself was quietly tolerated. This approach reflected a broader cultural pragmatism, one that acknowledged the persistence of human behavior even as it sought to minimize its risks. The balance between morality and policy tilted toward practicality, ensuring that the army could function without being paralyzed by scandal or disease. Morality was also invoked at the local level. Communities in occupied territories often condemned women who engaged in prostitution, labeling them collaborators or traitors. Yet those same communities sometimes relied on the resources these women brought back: food, clothing, or protection. The moral judgment was real, but it coexisted uneasily with the reality of survival. After liberation, public humiliations of women accused of horizontal collaboration served as a way for communities to reassert moral authority, even as they ignored the complexities of wartime choices. Morality became a performance, enacted in public squares, masking the quiet compromises that had sustained life under occupation. The clash between morality and policy also played out in religious contexts. Churches across Europe condemned prostitution as sinful, yet some priests and pastors turned a blind eye when parishioners engaged in it to keep families alive. In Japan, Confucian and Shinto traditions emphasizing honor and purity were twisted to justify the subjugation of women in comfort stations. In each case, morality was reshaped by the pressures of war, stretched to justify or condemn, depending on the circumstances. The line between principle and practice blurred, leaving behind a legacy of contradiction that would shape post-war memory. What these examples reveal is that morality in wartime was rarely absolute. It was filtered through the lens of necessity, reshaped by ideology, and enforced selectively depending on the needs of the moment. Military policies toward prostitution were not guided by consistent principles, but by shifting calculations. The need to preserve health, maintain discipline, prevent scandal, or simply manage desire. The result was a landscape of contradiction, where official condemnation coexisted with quiet tolerance, and where words like purity, honor, and protection were invoked even as exploitation thrived. For the women caught in this web, morality was often a weapon used against them. They were judged harshly, branded as collaborators or sinners, while the men who visited brothels faced little scrutiny. Their choices, made under duress or necessity, were rarely understood in their full complexity. Instead, they became symbols of moral failure, scapegoats for societies eager to reassert their values after the chaos of war. In this way, morality functioned less as a guide for policy and more as a tool of judgment, applied unevenly and often unjustly. The clash between ideals and necessity left contradictions that shaped both soldiers and civilians, judgments often falling hardest on the most vulnerable. These shifting boundaries of morality guide us now to the encounters of the American soldiers themselves, where policy, culture, and survival met on foreign soil. When American soldiers crossed the Atlantic to join the fight in Europe, and later when they marched across the Pacific Islands, they brought with them not only weapons and supplies, but also the culture, expectations, and anxieties of a nation that had tried, at least outwardly, to keep its distance from the politics of prostitution. The United States military, more than many of its allies, attempted to project an image of moral purity, discipline, and restraint. Yet once American soldiers were deployed abroad, they found themselves immersed in environments where poverty, scarcity, and the demands of war made prostitution impossible to ignore. The story of their encounters reveals another layer of the war's hidden history, shaped by contradictions between official policy and lived reality. From the beginning, American military leaders were determined to distinguish their forces from those of European powers, where regulated brothels were more openly accepted. U.S. policy officially prohibited prostitution, framing it as both a moral failing and a threat to health. Commanders issued strict orders warning against brothels, and public campaigns warned soldiers of the dangers of venereal disease. Posters depicted infected women as enemies, spreading illness as surely as any opposing army. In speeches, officers appealed to ideals of discipline and duty, urging soldiers to resist temptation. The message was clear. Visiting prostitutes was not only dangerous but unpatriotic, a betrayal of the fight for freedom and honor. Yet reality was never so simple. As American troops arrived in Britain, before the invasion of Normandy, they encountered a civilian population already living under strain. British women, facing shortages and bombings, sometimes engaged in prostitution as a means of survival, while soldiers flush with pay and rations offered opportunities for trade. Encounters flourished, despite official disapproval. For many soldiers, the experience was not framed as immorality, but as an inevitable part of wartime life, a release from the pressures of combat and separation from home. The U.S. military could warn, but it could not prevent. In France after D-Day, the situation grew even more pronounced. Liberated cities were filled with civilians struggling to recover, and American soldiers arrived as symbols of victory and abundance. Chocolate, cigarettes, and nylon stockings became tokens of exchange, and prostitution, both formal and informal, flourished in the shadow of liberation. Some women sought out these encounters willingly, eager to escape hunger or to enjoy the luxuries that Americans could provide. Others did so reluctantly, driven by poverty or coercion. For the soldiers, the encounters often carried a dual meaning. They were at once about desire and about the thrill of victory, intimacy fused with the sense of having brought freedom. Yet for the women, the aftermath was often more complicated, as communities judged them harshly for their associations with foreigners. In Germany, the contradictions deepened. After 1945, American soldiers became part of the occupation force, living in a country devastated by bombing and defeat. German women, facing shortages of food and clothing, turned to prostitution as one of the few means of survival. Soldiers, meanwhile, were officially warned against fraternization with the enemy, yet in practice, relationships of all kinds, transactional, romantic, coerced, flourished. The policy of non-fraternization was eventually relaxed, as authorities recognized its futility, but by then the damage had been done. Women who had engaged with Americans were stigmatized as Ami girls, a label that carried both fascination and scorn. For many, their lives were forever marked by choices made in the desperate months of occupation. In the Pacific, the encounters took on a different form. American troops stationed in the Philippines, New Guinea, and later Japan found themselves in environments where local economies had been shattered and where poverty made prostitution an ever-present reality. Military authorities attempted to set up regulated zones to keep encounters under control, but soldiers often sought out informal arrangements with civilians. In Japan, after the surrender, authorities initially tolerated prostitution as a way of managing soldiers' desires and preventing assaults, before later shutting down official brothels under pressure from American reformers. Here, too, the contradiction between official morality and unofficial practice played out in stark relief, leaving behind memories that were rarely acknowledged in public discourse. The medical side of these encounters loomed large in the American experience. Despite official prohibitions, venereal disease remained a major problem, and treatment centers were established across Europe and the Pacific. Soldiers who contracted infections were not only treated but also reprimanded, reinforcing the message that such encounters were both dangerous and irresponsible. Yet the persistence of disease revealed the limits of policy, showing that desire could not be contained by lectures or pamphlets. In practice, prevention and treatment became as much a part of the military medical system as vaccinations or surgery. For the soldiers themselves, the memories of encounters varied widely. Some recalled them with nostalgia, as fleeting moments of escape from the horrors of war. Others remembered them with shame, uneasy about the imbalance of power or the stigma of disease. Diaries, letters, and post-war interviews reveal a spectrum of feelings: desire, guilt, loneliness, even affection. What unites them is the way intimacy was reshaped by war, reduced to transactions that were at once deeply personal and profoundly shaped by the structures of occupation and military policy. For the women, the aftermath was often far harsher. In Britain, France, and Germany, women associated with American soldiers faced suspicion, stigma, and sometimes violence. Their choices, made under the pressure of survival, were judged as moral failings, while the soldiers moved on, returning home to families and parades. In Japan, women who had worked in brothels during the occupation carried their experiences in silence, rarely acknowledged by the society around them. The asymmetry of power was evident not only during the war, but also in its aftermath, as the legacies of these encounters fell disproportionately on the women involved. The story of American soldiers and prostitution during the Second World War thus reveals the enduring tension between morality and reality. Official policy condemned, communities judged, and yet the encounters persisted, shaped by desire, scarcity, and survival. They remind us that war reshapes intimacy as surely as it reshapes borders, pulling the most private aspects of human life into the orbit of conflict. In the footsteps of American soldiers, we find not only battles and victories, but also quiet, hidden stories carried in the shadows of liberation and occupation. As we close this chapter, we are left with the image of young men far from home, carrying both the ideals of their nation and the loneliness of separation, encountering women whose lives had been overturned by war. Between them lay exchanges that were rarely simple, rarely fair, and rarely remembered. Yet they, too, form part of the fabric of the war, reminding us that history is written not only in triumphs, but also in the fragile, hidden encounters that shaped lives in ways often left unspoken. As the guns fell silent in 1945, and nations around the world celebrated the end of the Second World War, the legacy of prostitution during the conflict did not simply vanish. For millions, the war had been an experience of upheaval, destruction, and survival, and for those whose lives had been tied to the hidden economies of intimacy, the end of fighting brought not liberation, but new struggles. The aftermath of prostitution in wartime revealed a complex story of silence, stigma, and survival that continued to shape lives long after the last bombs were dropped. For the women who had been involved, whether in official brothels, in comfort stations, or in the shadowy networks of black market desire, the end of the war often meant facing the judgment of their communities. In France, Women accused of sleeping with German soldiers, whether prostitutes, lovers, or even women who had been coerced, were publicly humiliated in acts of symbolic purification. Their heads were shaved, they were paraded through the streets, and they became living symbols of collaboration. These rituals, carried out in towns and cities across the country, reflected the anger of communities eager to reclaim dignity after years of occupation. Yet they also revealed the injustice of post-war judgment, where the complexities of survival were flattened into simple narratives of betrayal. In Germany, the situation was similarly fraught. Women who had survived the war through prostitution found themselves stigmatized in a society, struggling to come to terms with defeat and destruction. The association with foreign soldiers, whether German or Allied, carried heavy social costs. Some women faced ostracism, others fell into deeper poverty, and many chose silence as their only means of survival in the post-war years. The official narrative of rebuilding left little room for their stories, pushing them into the shadows of history. For the survivors of the Japanese comfort women system, the end of the war brought no immediate relief. Many were abandoned in foreign lands, left without resources or support, their families unaware of what had happened to them. Returning home, if possible, often meant facing stigma and silence, as communities struggled to acknowledge the realities of coercion and abuse. For decades, their voices remained unheard, buried beneath layers of shame and denial. Only in the late 20th century did these women begin to speak publicly, demanding recognition and justice. Their stories remind us that the aftermath of war can stretch across generations, as the legacies of silence and trauma refuse to fade. The Allied soldiers, returning home, often left their encounters behind. In the United States, Britain, and other countries, veterans were celebrated as heroes, their wartime experiences framed in terms of sacrifice and victory. The memories of prostitution, whether nostalgic or shameful, were rarely spoken of, folded into private recollection rather than public discourse. For many, the encounters became just one more fragment of a complex wartime experience, overshadowed by battles, losses, and triumphs. For the women, however, the legacy was far heavier, carried in the judgment of neighbors, the silence of families, and the burden of stigma that outlasted the war itself. The economics of survival also shifted dramatically in the aftermath. In the ruins of Germany and Japan, prostitution became a survival strategy for many women, now seeking to feed themselves and their families in cities reduced to rubble. The presence of occupying armies created new opportunities and new dangers, as women exchanged intimacy for food, shelter, or safety. These post-war economies of survival were not simply continuations of wartime prostitution, but adaptations to the devastation left behind. In this sense, the aftermath of prostitution was not confined to 1945, but stretched into the early years of Reconstruction, woven into the broader struggle to endure amid scarcity and ruin. The moral dimension of the aftermath cannot be overlooked. Communities eager to restore dignity often projected their anger onto women, branding them as collaborators or sinners, while ignoring the complexities of their choices. Men, whether soldiers or civilians, faced far less judgment for their roles, their actions folded into narratives of necessity or overlooked entirely. The uneven distribution of stigma reveals how morality was applied selectively, often punishing those with the least power to resist. For women, the post-war years were not a time of liberation, but of renewed silence, as their experiences were erased from the public record and buried beneath layers of shame. In the aftermath, there were also moments of resilience. Some women rebuilt their lives quietly, marrying, raising families, and carrying their memories in silence. Others found strength in solidarity, joining movements decades later to demand recognition and justice. Their resilience reminds us that even in the face of silence and stigma, the human spirit endures, finding ways to transform suffering into testimony. Yet for every woman who spoke, countless others remained silent, their stories lost to history, their legacies carried only in unspoken memories. As nations rebuilt, the subject of prostitution during the war was largely excluded from official histories. Governments preferred to celebrate victories, honor soldiers, and focus on reconstruction, rather than confront uncomfortable truths about survival, exploitation, and intimacy in wartime. The silence of states mirrored the silence of survivors, creating a historical void that only later generations would begin to fill. It is only through the slow uncovering of testimonies, documents, and memories that the hidden aftermath of prostitution during the war has begun to emerge, reminding us that the end of conflict does not erase its legacies. The end of fighting did not mean the end of pain. For many women, liberation brought humiliation, stigma, or silence rather than peace. Their struggles carried forward into the post-war years, shaping how memory and justice would be sought. And it is to those trials and the search for acknowledgement that we now turn. When the Second World War ended, the world turned to the question of justice. Tribunals were established, leaders were tried, and crimes against humanity were brought into the open. Yet within this search for accountability, the subject of prostitution and sexual exploitation during the war occupied an uneasy place. In some instances, it was addressed directly, recognized as a form of war crime. In others, it was overlooked, minimized, or silenced, as governments and societies chose to focus on other aspects of the conflict. The story of how prostitution was or was not acknowledged in the war crimes trials reveals both the progress and the limitations of post-war justice. The most direct acknowledgement came in the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, where Japanese leaders were prosecuted for crimes committed during the war. Among the charges brought forward were those related to the system of comfort women, which had coerced tens of thousands into sexual slavery. Evidence presented at the trials revealed how women had been deceived, abducted, and forced into brothels that followed the Japanese army across Asia. Witnesses testified to the scale of the abuse, and the existence of the system was recognized as part of the broader pattern of exploitation and violence committed by the Japanese military. In this sense, the comfort women system was brought into the realm of international justice, identified not merely as immorality, but as a crime. Yet even here, the acknowledgement was limited. While the comfort women system was mentioned, it did not receive the sustained attention given to other crimes, such as massacres or forced labor. Few survivors were able to testify directly, and much of the evidence came from documents rather than personal voices. As a result, the issue, though recognized, remained overshadowed by larger narratives. In the years that followed, Japan's government was slow to accept responsibility, and survivors struggled for decades to gain acknowledgement, apology, and reparations. The trials had opened a door, but they had not walked through it fully. In Europe, the situation was even more muted. At the Nuremberg trials, where Nazi leaders faced justice, the subject of brothels and prostitution was mentioned but not emphasized. Testimonies revealed the existence of camp brothels in Auschwitz, Buchenwald, and other sites, where women were coerced into serving prisoners as part of a system of manipulation and control. Yet these practices were folded into broader charges of crimes against humanity rather than highlighted in their own right. The focus was on extermination, forced labor, and mass atrocities, leaving the specific exploitation of women in prostitution under-acknowledged. For many survivors, this silence felt like another layer of erasure, as their suffering was subsumed under categories that did not fully capture their experience. In national courts across Europe, where collaborators and war criminals were tried, prostitution was often treated not as a crime committed against women, but as a sign of women as guilt. Trials in France and other countries frequently targeted women accused of relationships with occupiers, branding them as traitors or collaborators. In these proceedings, women were punished for their associations, regardless of whether those associations had been voluntary, coerced, or transactional for survival. The irony was stark. Women who had been exploited or forced into prostitution often faced judgment, while the systems that had coerced them received little attention. Justice in this sense was unevenly distributed, punishing the powerless while overlooking the structures of power that had shaped their lives. The silence in many of these trials reflected broader societal discomfort. To acknowledge prostitution as a crime would have required recognizing the extent to which women's bodies had been commodified, coerced, and exploited in wartime. It would also have required confronting the complicity of governments, militaries, and communities that had tolerated or facilitated such systems. Instead, many courts and tribunals chose to look away, focusing on crimes that fit more neatly into legal categories and public narratives. The result was a partial justice, where some crimes were acknowledged while others remained hidden. In later decades, the struggle for acknowledgement continued. Survivors of the comfort women system began to speak publicly in the 1990s, filing lawsuits and demanding apologies. Their voices forced governments to confront issues long buried in silence. In Germany and other European countries, research into camp brothels and wartime prostitution expanded, bringing greater awareness to histories once overlooked. Yet the path to recognition was slow, and for many survivors, it came too late to bring healing. Justice delayed was, for them, justice denied. The war crimes trials and their aftermath revealed the difficulty of confronting sexual exploitation in wartime. They show how societies prioritize certain crimes over others, how silence can be as powerful as acknowledgement, and how justice is often incomplete. The partial recognition of prostitution as a crime left deep scars, reminding us that the process of remembering and reckoning with history is never straightforward. The trials gave voice to some crimes while muting others, leaving survivors with only partial recognition. Justice was uneven, and silence often prevailed. From these courtrooms, we move to the fragile terrain of memory itself, the ways stories were carried in silence or spoken only decades later. Long after the war ended, when cities were rebuilt and nations moved on to new challenges, the memories of prostitution during the Second World War lingered in the shadows. For many survivors, the war did not end in 1945. It continued in silence, in stigma, and in the private burden of memories too painful to share. The history of wartime prostitution is as much a story of what was remembered as it is a story of what was forgotten, erased, or deliberately silenced. To explore this legacy is to confront the way societies choose which histories to tell and which to hide. For women who survived systems of coercion, such as the Japanese comfort stations, silence was often the only option for decades. Returning home, many faced shame from their families and communities. In cultures where purity and honor were deeply valued, to admit to being a comfort woman meant risking rejection or humiliation. Some survivors chose never to speak, burying their memories so deeply that even their children and grandchildren never knew. Others tried but found that no one wanted to listen, that their suffering did not fit into the heroic narratives of resistance and victory that dominated post-war storytelling. In their silence, they carried the war within them, long after the world had declared peace. The same was true for women in Europe. Those who had survived by engaging in prostitution with occupying soldiers often faced harsh judgment after liberation. In France, the public rituals of head shaving and humiliation silenced women more effectively than any censorship. Few dared to speak of the complexities of their choices, for society was eager to see them only as collaborators, not as survivors navigating impossible circumstances. In Germany, women who had endured prostitution under occupation or in the rubble of post-war cities kept their memories to themselves, unwilling to risk stigma in a society that was already struggling to confront defeat and guilt. Silence became a survival strategy, a way to protect themselves and their families from further pain. Yet silence was not only personal, it was also collective. Governments and institutions often avoided the subject, preferring to focus on narratives of victory, resistance, or rebuilding. The Allied nations celebrated liberation, downplaying the complexities of survival economies that included prostitution. Japan, for decades, denied or minimized the existence of the comfort women system, choosing national pride over acknowledgement of suffering. In many cases, prostitution was treated not as history, but as shame, something to be erased rather than remembered. This collective silence shaped the way generations understood the war, leaving entire dimensions of experience hidden from view. Memory, however, has a way of resurfacing. In the late 20th century, survivors began to speak. Elderly women who had once been comfort women stepped forward to share their testimonies, demanding recognition and justice. Their voices cracked the wall of silence, forcing governments, historians, and the public to confront histories long denied. In Europe, researchers began to uncover the hidden stories of camp brothels, black market economies, and the everyday survival strategies of women under occupation. What had once been whispered or ignored became subjects of scholarship, art, and public debate. Memory, long suppressed, began to emerge into the light. The process of remembering, however, was never easy. Survivors often paid a price for breaking silence, facing renewed stigma or backlash. In Japan, women who spoke of their experiences sometimes encountered denial or hostility, their testimonies contested in political debates. In Europe, the descendants of women judged for relationships with occupiers sometimes preferred to keep those histories hidden, fearing the reopening of old wounds. Memory, when it resurfaced, carried both healing and pain, both recognition and resistance. The struggle to speak was itself a continuation of the war, fought not with weapons, but with words, courage, and persistence. The role of historians, activists, and artists has been central in this process. By documenting testimonies, creating memorials, and writing histories, they have worked to ensure that silence does not erase the past. Statues to comfort women now stand in cities across the world, serving as public reminders of suffering once hidden. Books, films, and exhibitions have explored the complexities of survival, bringing nuance to stories once told only in whispers. These efforts are part of a broader recognition that memory is not fixed but contested, shaped by the choices of those who tell and those who listen. What emerges from the story of memory and silence is a reminder of how fragile history can be. Without the voices of survivors, without the persistence of those who listen, entire dimensions of the past can vanish, erased by stigma, denial, or neglect. Yet memory, even when silenced, often endures in hidden ways, carried in unspoken pain, in family secrets, in the quiet resilience of those who survived. To honor these memories is to acknowledge not only what was spoken, but also what was withheld, to see silence itself as part of history. Silence weighed heavily on survivors, but memory endured, breaking through in voices that refused to be forgotten. The struggle between forgetting and remembering shapes how we understand the war today. And with these echoes lingering, we arrive at our final reflection: what this history reveals about prostitution, war, and human nature. As we reach the final chapter of this story, we are left with a question that extends beyond the events of the Second World War. What does the history of prostitution in wartime reveal about human nature itself? In looking back over the hidden brothels, the coerced systems, the survival economies, and the silences that followed, we find not only a history of exploitation, but also a reflection of deeper truths about desire, power, and survival. Prostitution in war is not merely an isolated phenomenon of the 1940s. It is part of a larger pattern that reveals how human beings respond to the pressures of conflict, scarcity, and fear. War is an environment where the ordinary rules of society break down. Structures collapse, moral codes blur, and survival becomes the foremost priority. In this world, prostitution emerges not simply because of desire, but because of need for food, need for protection, need for comfort in the face of fear. For soldiers, it often represented an escape from loneliness, a brief reprieve from the stress of combat. For women, it was frequently a matter of endurance, a strategy to survive when all other options were stripped away. The convergence of these needs created spaces where intimacy was reshaped into transaction, where human connection was reduced to negotiation, and where survival was measured in moments rather than years. The story also reveals the ways in which power distorts intimacy. In the brothels of the Wehrmacht, the comfort stations of the Japanese army, and the underground economies of occupied cities, intimacy was never equal. Soldiers carried weapons, authority, and resources. Women carried vulnerability, hunger, and fear. In this imbalance, choice became fragile, agency narrowed, and survival often meant submission. This distortion is not unique to the Second World War, but is part of a larger truth about how power shapes human relationships, especially in times of crisis. War magnifies these inequalities, exposing the fragility of human dignity when survival is at stake. At the same time, the history of prostitution in wartime reveals resilience. Women who endured these systems were not only victims, but also survivors. They navigated impossible circumstances, making choices that were often misunderstood or judged harshly afterward. Their stories remind us that survival itself can be an act of resistance. That dignity can persist even in the most dehumanizing conditions. The very fact that some of these women later found the courage to speak, to share their testimonies, and to demand recognition reveals a strength that outlasted the structures of war. In their voices, we hear not only pain but also endurance, a testament to the capacity of the human spirit to survive even when humanity is denied. The silence that followed the war is also part of this larger reflection. That so many women remained unheard for decades speaks not only to stigma, but also to the difficulty societies face in confronting uncomfortable truths. Memory and silence exist side by side, each revealing something about human nature. Silence shows the weight of shame, the fear of judgment, and the ease with which societies can overlook those who do not fit heroic narratives. Memory, when it finally breaks through, reveals the persistence of truth, the refusal of history to remain hidden forever. Together, they show that the struggle to tell these stories is ongoing, part of the human effort to understand itself through the past. What then? Does this history tell us about war and humanity? It tells us that war is not only fought with guns and tanks, but also in the quiet, hidden spaces of survival. It tells us that human desire does not disappear in crisis, but instead reshapes itself in ways both intimate and tragic. It tells us that power can corrupt intimacy, turning it into a weapon of control. But it also tells us that resilience endures, even in silence. Above all, it reminds us that history is not only about victories and defeats, but about lives lived in the shadows, about choices made under duress, and about the human cost of survival. Prostitution in the Second World War was not a side story. It was part of the war's fabric, woven into its daily life, its ideologies, its economies, and its aftermath. To ignore it is to miss a vital part of how war reshapes humanity. To confront it is to acknowledge the full spectrum of human experience, from cruelty to resilience, from exploitation to endurance. It forces us to see the war not only as a matter of armies and leaders, but as a series of intimate human encounters, each carrying its own weight of suffering, survival, and silence. As we close this final chapter, we are left with a reminder that history is never simple. It is made up of contradictions, desire and fear, choice and coercion, silence and memory. In the story of prostitution during the Second World War, we see all of these contradictions laid bare, revealing not only the realities of the past, but also the truths of human nature. It is a story that asks us to remember, to listen, and to see beyond the surface, into the hidden lives that shape the world we know today. As we bring this journey to an end, let us pause to reflect on what we have uncovered together. We have walked through the hidden corridors of history, exploring the secret brothels, the underground economies, and the silences that surrounded prostitution during the Second World War. Along the way, we have seen how war reshaped the most intimate aspects of human life, blurring the lines between choice and coercion, survival and exploitation, silence and memory. These stories, though often unspoken, form an essential part of the war's legacy, reminding us that history is not only written in battles and treaties, but also in the hidden lives of those who endured in the shadows. If you are listening now, perhaps in the quiet hours of night or in a moment of rest, I invite you to take a deep breath and let these stories settle gently. History is never easy, and the subjects we have touched upon are heavy, yet they are also important, for they remind us of the resilience of the human spirit and the need to honor even the voices that were once silenced. By remembering these hidden histories, we ensure they are not lost to time, and we extend compassion to those who carried them in silence. If you are new here, welcome to History for Sleep. This channel is a space where the past is told slowly, softly, and thoughtfully to help you drift into rest while also learning about the corners of history too often forgotten. If you found comfort in this story, I encourage you to subscribe so that you can return to these quiet journeys whenever you wish. And if there are stories you would like to hear, or if you simply want to share when and how you listen, whether late at night, during restless mornings, or in quiet moments of reflection, please leave a comment. Your voice helps shape this space, and your presence here is deeply valued. As you close your eyes and let the day fade, carry with you the reminder that even in the darkest hours of history, people endured, survived, and in their own way resisted. Their stories remain with us, not as whispers lost to time, but as lessons in resilience and reminders of the human need for dignity, even in the midst of war. May these stories bring you not only knowledge, but also peace, and may you find rest as the echoes of the past fade gently into silence.